The auction house smelled like old money and newer ambition, polished floors, cathedral ceilings, and 200 people arranged in curved rows who had collectively decided, without discussing it, that they were the kind of people who belonged in rooms like this. The lighting had been designed by someone who understood that the right kind of light made expensive things look inevitable. The catalog for the afternoon session ran to 47 pages. The thinnest lot description was 3 paragraphs. The longest was a full page with footnotes. The cars arrived on rotating platforms, each one lit from below like an artifact recovered from somewhere important, each one carrying a number that had been agreed upon in advance by people who understood the language of agreed upon numbers. A 1967 Shelby GT 500 opened the session and drew a response from the room that sounded like collective approval, the specific murmur of people confirming to each other that they already knew what good looked like. A restored E-Type Jaguar came next, silver, concours condition, the kind of car that belonged in a museum and probably would end up in one. Then a pair of early Porsches, both in German spec, both documented to a standard that would satisfy any serious buyer. The room was comfortable. The room knew where it was. The room understood the language being spoken. Then they brought in the Datsun. It came on a flatbed dolly, pushed by 2 attendants who were making the particular effort of men trying not to look like they were apologizing for something they hadn't personally done. The paint had oxidized to a color that couldn't decide between brown and nothing. A slow fade that had taken decades to complete and wore those decades openly. The left rear quarter panel had a dent the size of a serving bowl, not a recent dent, not the kind made by an inattentive parking lot neighbor, but an old settled dent that had long since stopped being an event and had simply become part of the shape of the thing. One wiper blade was missing, the other was present but offered nothing in the way of optimism. There was surface rust along the rocker panels, the particular rust that forms when a car has been kept rather than driven, sitting still while moisture worked at it over years too quiet to notice. The dolly stopped in the center of the platform. The laughter started from the left side of the room. Reginald Voss, 61 years old, fourth-generation money, a man whose personal collection included a 1962 Ferrari GTO that had once belonged to a Formula One driver whose name appeared on the wall of his study, and a Bugatti Veyron that had never once been driven in rain because rain was not the point, leaned toward the woman beside him and said something behind his catalog. It was a short sentence, delivered with the ease of a man who had spent 60 years in rooms that laughed at his jokes before he finished them. The woman beside him smiled with the practiced restraint of someone who had learned to find the same things funny as the people who signed their checks. 2 rows behind Voss, a group of younger dealers in expensive watches exchanged the look that expensive watches often facilitated, a horizontal transaction of shared amusement. Someone near the back said something that drew a second wave of response. The auctioneer waited with the professional patience of a man who had learned that rooms needed to finish their feelings before they could be redirected toward bidding. Across the room, near the back wall, standing rather than seated, a man named Ellis Carver looked at the Datsun and did not smile. He was 44 years old, and nothing about him announced itself. Brown jacket, the kind purchased for function and kept until it stopped functioning. Clean shoes with a small scuff on the left toe that he either hadn't noticed or had noticed and decided was beneath his attention. No catalog in his hands. No paddle registered under a firm name or a family trust or an LLC incorporated in a state chosen for its tax structure. He had come in through the public entrance 23 minutes before the doors officially opened and had stood in front of that Datsun for 11 minutes before anyone else arrived. He had not taken a photograph. He had not made a call. He had not consulted anything written down. He had crouched near the rear axle for a long moment with the focused attention of a man doing a calculation that had no visible components. Then he had stood and looked at the engine through the gap in the hood latch, which had been left partially open, and he had done that for another 30 seconds. And then he had stepped back and looked at the whole car from a distance of approximately 8 feet and stood very still in the way that people stand when they have already finished thinking and have moved past thinking into something quieter and more decisive. Then he had found a seat near the back wall and waited for the session to begin. The opening bid on the Datsun was set at $40,000. The auctioneer said it with the neutral professionalism of a man delivering information he had not personally authored. The number hung in the room for a moment. Reginald Voss laughed again. This time, he didn't bother with the catalog. The bidding opened. A dealer near the center of the room, a man named Jeff Strand, who ran a classic car brokerage out of a showroom in Scottsdale and had attended this auction for 11 consecutive years, raised his paddle to 41. A second paddle, belonging to a buyer's representative whose principal Ellis did not recognize, came in at 45. Strand went to 50. The representative to 55. Strand to 61. The representative paused, consulted his phone, set the phone down, dropped. From the back of the room, a paddle that had not yet moved came up quietly. $62,500. The auctioneer acknowledged it, looked to the room. Strand looked at his phone, looked at the car on the platform, and made the specific decision of a man who has decided that the thing in front of him is not worth the argument. Dropped. Gavel. Sold. The room had already moved on. The next lot, a 1969 Camaro Z28 in show condition, was already being positioned on the secondary platform. The murmur of commentary shifted direction. The Datsun was being pushed off the main floor by the same two attendants who had brought it in, and they were doing it now with the additional efficiency of men who had finished being apologetic and were simply completing a task. In the back of the room, Ellis Carver wrote the lot number on a small piece of paper, folded it, placed it in his jacket pocket, and stood up. He walked out the way he had come in, through the public entrance, across the parking lot, to a truck that was 7 years old and had a trailer hitch installed not for appearance, but because he routinely needed it. He made one call from the parking lot. 30 seconds. Then he drove to a diner 2 blocks from the warehouse and ate lunch alone and read nothing and said nothing to anyone and looked, to anyone who might have been watching, like a man with no particular thoughts about the morning. He looked that way because he had learned over a long time that the things you had figured out were best kept somewhere no one could see them until the moment came when it mattered that you had. 7 days later, that Datsun sold for $9,200,000. The man who bought it had been looking for it, in one sense, for 31 years. The man who sold it had been looking for it, in another sense, since the morning he crouched by the rear axle and understood what he was looking at before the room had finished laughing. The man who laughed read about it 6 weeks later in a magazine that he would leave open to the same page for 3 months without explaining why. This is what happened in the 7 days between those two moments, and why almost every person in that room, despite their catalogs and their paddles and their collected decades of knowing what good looked like, missed something that had been sitting in plain sight on a flatbed dolly under auction house lights, and why missing it was not, in the end, a matter of information. It was a matter of how to read. Ellis Carver had grown up in a house where the driveway told more truth than the interior. The house itself was ordinary in the way that working-class houses in the Central Valley were ordinary in the 1980s. Practical, adequate, maintained out of pride rather than resources. His mother kept the kitchen the way certain women keep kitchens, clean past the point of necessity, as a form of argument against the disorder that pressed in from other directions. His father kept the garage the way certain men keep garages, which is to say that the garage was less a room than an extension of how Dale Carver understood the world. Dale Carver had been a mechanic in the specific way that some men are mechanics, not as a job they had taken because it was available, not as a trade they had been trained in by someone else's program. He was a mechanic the way some people are musicians, which is to say that the relationship between him and machines was not primarily cognitive. He heard things, he felt things through his hands. He understood the logic of a system not by studying it, but by listening to it, and machines, in his presence, seemed to operate with a kind of cooperation that they withheld from other people. He passed this to Ellis not through formal instruction. There were no lessons with titles, no sequence of skills introduced in deliberate order. What Ellis received was proximity. Saturday mornings in the garage with the radio on a station his father never changed. The smell of penetrating oil and clean rags, and the particular metal smell of a car that had been opened up and was waiting. The specific silence of a man working on a problem that he respected enough to give his whole attention to. Dale Carver was not a man who said much. What he said once, and he said it without decoration. The summer before the diagnosis, he had been standing in the driveway in the early evening, wiping his hands on a shop rag, looking at a 1971 Datsun 240Z that was in partial disassembly in the left bay of the garage. Ellis was 19 and had been home from his first year of community college for 2 weeks and had not yet decided what to do with the rest of his life. He was standing beside his father, also looking at the car, doing what you do when you are 19 and the person you are standing beside has not spoken yet. They'll overlook what they can't read, Dale said. He wasn't looking at Ellis. He was looking at the car. That's not their fault. He folded the shop rag and put it in his back pocket. Most people can't read. He went inside. Ellis stayed in the driveway for another 20 minutes, looking at the Datsun in the fading light and understanding the sentence only partially, the way you understand things at 19, which is enough to know they matter but not yet enough to know why. Dale Carver died 8 months later. He left behind 3 things that constituted the operational center of what he had been. The 240Z in partial disassembly. A spiral-bound notebook filled with handwriting so precise and small it looked as though it had been produced by a machine that had been taught to care. And the sentence in the driveway, which Ellis would spend the next 25 years understanding more completely, one car at a time, in one room after another, until the understanding became something he no longer needed to think about. It had simply become how he saw. He did not become a mechanic. He considered it and set it aside the way you set aside things that are close to what you want, but not exactly it. He spent 2 years finishing his degree in something practical that he had chosen because it was available, and then spent the first 8 years after that in restoration work. Private commissions, mostly. People who already knew what they had and wanted it returned to what it had been. This required skill and patience and the ability to understand something's original intention well enough to serve it rather than redirect it. He was good at it. He built a reputation in a small network of serious collectors who recommended him to each other in the specific way that serious people recommended specific people, carefully, and only when they were certain. Then, in his early 30s, he began doing something different. It had started not with a plan, but with an accident. He had gone to an estate sale in the Sacramento Valley to look at a car he had been told about by a client, a late 1960s muscle car that turned out to be less than advertised. But in the back of the property, behind a barn that smelled like hay and 40 years of disuse, under a tarp that had been there long enough to have partially adhered to what it was covering, he found a 1957 Porsche 356 Speedster in a color so rare it had required 3 phone calls over 2 days to verify. The estate had no idea what it was. The price reflected that. He bought it. He held it for 4 months while the documentation came together. He sold it to a collector in Munich for a number that was not $9 million, but was enough to reorient his sense of what the work could look like. After that, he began to look at the overlooked things, not as a strategy, not initially, but as a natural extension of what his father had put into him in that driveway. He went to auctions where the rooms were distracted by the obvious things and watched what got passed over. He went to estate sales where the heirs didn't know what they had inherited. He went to storage facility auctions when the contents hadn't been opened in long enough that no one had a picture of what was inside. He was looking for what the room couldn't read. He found it often enough to build a business around finding it. Not a large business, not a visible one. Two assistants, a warehouse, a network of authenticators and specialists who had worked with him long enough to understand that he was not interested in speed or volume, only in being correct. He had been correct enough times that his name traveled in certain directions on its own. He did not advertise. He did not maintain a public presence. He existed, professionally, as a name that serious people mentioned to other serious people, in the careful way that serious people shared anything they considered genuinely valuable. On a Tuesday morning in October, he had stood in an auction house and crouched by the rear axle of a rusted 240Z and understood, before the room had finished arranging itself into rows, what he was looking at. He had paid $62,500 for it. He had driven away with the particular composure of a man who had learned long ago that the most important things were best received quietly. His warehouse was in a part of the city that real estate listings had been describing as transitional for 11 years, without the transition completing itself. The building was concrete block, functional, heated in winter by a system that worked better than it looked, and occupied by Ellis, his two assistants, and whatever cars were currently in his possession and at various stages of documentation or waiting. Petra Vane had been with him for 6 years. She was 38, practical in the specific way that made impractical situations resolvable, and had come to him from an insurance appraisal background that had given her a thorough and slightly exhausted knowledge of how often people were wrong about what things were worth. She had stayed because the work was different from insurance appraisal in a way she found difficult to fully articulate but experienced as the difference between being asked to confirm a number and being asked to find one. The second assistant, a 26-year-old named Marcus Webb, had started as a part-time driver and had, over 3 years, demonstrated a capacity for research that Ellis found genuinely useful. He had the kind of attention to detail that looked like obsession from the outside and felt, from the inside, simply like caring whether you were right. The Datsun arrived on the flatbed at 4:15 that afternoon. Petra walked around it once, hands in her jacket pockets, without speaking. The full circuit took her about 45 seconds. She stopped at the rear and looked at the panel damage, then at the rocker rust, then at the hood latch. "How bad is the surface?" she said. "Irrelevant," Ellis said. She looked at him. "It's original," he said. "All of it. The paint, the interior, the mechanicals. I haven't confirmed everything yet, but the indicators are consistent, matching numbers." Petra looked at the car again with the different quality of attention that those two words produced in people who understood what they meant. In the world Ellis moved through, matching numbers was not a marketing phrase. It was a factual description of a condition that became rarer with each decade, a vehicle in which the engine, transmission, and major components still carried the factory-stamped codes that corresponded to each other and to the original build record, meaning the car had never been substantially rebuilt, never had its heart replaced with something foreign to it. For a 240Z, a car that had been driven hard by its enthusiasts for 50 years, that had been modified and restored and raced and used, finding one in original unmolested condition was the automotive equivalent of finding a first edition in the original binding, unread. "Matching date codes?" Petra said. "On the carburetor and the distributor. I couldn't get into the full engine bay at the auction, but what I saw was consistent. The odometer reads 34,200. Is it rolled? I don't think so." He paused. "I think it's real." Petra, was quiet for a long moment. She walked to the driver's door, which was unlocked, opened it carefully, and looked at the interior without touching it. The seat vinyl had cracked in the way that seat vinyl cracked over decades in storage, not from use, but from time. The dashboard showed no sun fade, which was consistent with a car that had spent its life undercover. The carpet was original, faded, but intact, and showed almost no wear in the driver's footwell. She closed the door gently. "Who else was bidding?" she said. "A Scottsdale dealer who dropped at 61, and a buyer's rep I didn't recognize who dropped at 55. Nobody else engaged. Who was in the room? Voss was there." Petra looked at him. "He laughed when they brought it in," Ellis said. "Of course he did," she said. She said it without edge. It was not a criticism of Voss. It was a description of a condition, the condition of being very good at seeing what everyone else could see, and having stopped there. "What do you need first?" "VIN against the factory build sheet," Ellis said. "And I want the chassis fully photographed before anyone touches anything. Full documentation from the undercarriage up. Marcus can start tonight." "In the morning," Ellis said. "In daylight. I want the photographs done right." He looked at the car one more time, at the oxidized paint and the settled dent and the missing wiper blade, at the surface evidence of 50 years of sitting still in a facility somewhere while the world moved past it, conducting its business, assigning its values, deciding what things were worth, at the thing the room had laughed at. "In the morning," he said again, quietly, more to himself than to her. And then he picked up his jacket and went home and did not call anyone and did not consult anything and slept with the uncomplicated efficiency of a man who had done the thing that needed doing and was waiting, without anxiety, for the rest of it to confirm what he already knew. The documentation process took 4 days. Not because the documentation was complicated or the trail was difficult to follow. The trail, once begun, was remarkably clear, each record leading to the next with the kind of coherence that suggested the car had been handled, at every stage, by people who understood that records mattered. It took 4 days because Ellis refused to do any of it quickly. Each element of verification was sent through a separate channel and given the time it needed to come back complete. He had learned, over years, that the temptation to compress verification was the point at which mistakes entered the process. Not large mistakes, but the kind of small, addressable mistakes that became large problems when someone on the other side of a 9-figure transaction had paid for certainty and received something slightly less than that. He was not in the business of slightly less. Marcus began the photography on the first morning. He was thorough in the way that Ellis had trained him to be thorough, which meant that by the time he finished, there were 340 photographs of the car taken in conditions of controlled, consistent lighting from angles that covered every surface, every component, every joint and seam and panel edge. The photographs would serve as the baseline documentation, the record of the car as received, before anything was done to it, which in this case meant before anything was done to it at all, since Ellis had already decided that nothing would be. On the afternoon of the first day, Ellis sent the VIN to a contact in Japan, a retired Nissan archivist named Kimura, who had spent 28 years maintaining the company's heritage vehicle records and who now consulted on a private basis for clients whose questions were serious enough to merit his time. Kimura's response came back in 14 hours. The VIN corresponded to a 240Z produced in the Optima plant in August of 1972. Color code, R code, the factory designation for what the sales materials of the period had called burnt orange, a color that had been available for a single model year on the Z car before being discontinued in favor of a palette that the marketing department of the period had apparently considered more commercial. Production numbers in that color, in that model year, were limited. The number Kimura provided was specific, and Ellis read it twice, and then sat with it for a few minutes before continuing. On the second day, Ellis found the note. He had been doing a careful manual review of the interior, not touching, only looking, using a small light that he moved slowly across surfaces to reveal what ambient light would not. Under the driver's seat, in the rearmost corner against the seat rail, he saw the edge of a piece of paper, folded twice, the color of paper that had been white and had become, over decades, the color of old things kept in dry places. He photographed it in position before touching it. Then he retrieved it with the care of someone handling a thing that did not belong to them. He unfolded it, read what was on it, and refolded it without reading it a second time. He placed it back exactly where he had found it. Then he sat back on his heels in the quiet of the warehouse and remained there for a moment, not thinking about the car, not thinking about the documentation or the timeline or what came next. He was thinking about his father in the driveway, about the sentence that had taken 25 years to understand completely. He stood up. He picked up his light. He continued the review. He did not tell Petra or Marcus what the note said. He did not tell anyone what the note said. Not then, not later, not ever. What he told Theo Bassett when Theo arrived on the afternoon of the second day was that there was a note under the driver's seat, and that it was personal, and that it was to remain where it was. Theo, who had seen enough in 40 years to understand the difference between information that changed the value of something and information that changed the nature of something, simply nodded and opened his equipment case and began his own process. Theo Bassett was 70 years old and had the particular physical quality of men who had spent decades in garages and under cars and in the specific awkward positions that careful work required, compact, deliberate in movement, with hands that still worked with a precision that suggested they had been trained by something longer and more serious than formal instruction. He had spent his career as an independent authenticator of Japanese performance vehicles, and the phrase independent authenticator covered a range of activities that in his case included everything from basic VIN verification to the kind of deep forensic examination of paint chemistry and rubber compound composition and weld seam characteristics that could determine, to a reasonable certainty, whether a car had been what it claimed to be since the day it left the factory. He was, among the people who knew what they were doing and cared about being certain, considered the standard. He brought his own light, as he always did, his own set of measuring instruments, a reference binder he had been adding to for 40 years that contained specifications, build records, factory tolerances, and production details for every significant Japanese performance vehicle he had ever authenticated, which was a number that had passed 800 somewhere in the previous decade. He spent 3 hours with the car. He did not speak during those 3 hours. Petra and Marcus had learned from Ellis that this was normal, and that the appropriate response was to leave him alone and find other things to do and not hover. Ellis sat in the office at the back of the warehouse and caught up on correspondence and waited with the patient attention of a man who had learned that certainty took the time it needed and could not be accelerated by watching someone achieve it. At the end of the 3rd hour, Theo came into the office, accepted the coffee that Petra had prepared in anticipation of his emergence, and sat down on the bench near the side door. He looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked at Ellis. "Where did this come from?" he said. It was not quite a question. Ellis told him. The Tuesday auction, the opening estimate, the room. Something moved across Theo's face. It was not amusement exactly. It was the expression of a man encountering a familiar situation that he had not stopped finding remarkable despite its familiarity. One other bidder, Scottsdale dealer, dropped at 61. Theo nodded. He turned the coffee cup once in his hands. "The car is what it presents as," he said. "Original paint, which I can confirm to factory spec by the chemistry in the lower door jamb where weather stripping protected it. Original engine, matching to the build sheet date. The drivetrain is unmolested, which I mean literally, not as a market description. No one has been inside this transmission. The rubber seals in the engine bay are original, which is the kind of detail that cannot be replicated convincingly. The degradation pattern is specific to the compound and the storage conditions and the time elapsed. This car has been in dry, stable storage for the majority of its life. He paused. Low humidity, consistent temperature. Whoever stored it understood what they were storing. He set the coffee down. Do you have the title history? Ellis slid the folder across the bench. Theo opened it with the economical movements of a man reading quickly and showing it only in the silence between page turns. He stopped on the third page. He read it. He read it again. His expression did not change, but his stillness changed, becoming a different quality of stillness. Roy Matsuda, he said. You know the name, Ellis said. I know the name from the production records, Theo said carefully. There are 14 people in the world who would know that name from the production records, and I am one of them. He looked at the folder. Roy Matsuda was a development engineer at Nissan's Oppima facility in the early 1970s. He was part of the team that worked on the second-generation Z car development program. He was not famous. He was not a name that appeared in press materials or enthusiast histories. He was an engineer who did serious work and was serious about the car he worked on, and who, when the technical exchange program brought him to the United States in 1972, specified a 240Z for his personal use with the particular care of a man ordering something he had helped make and understood completely. He turned the page. Color, transmission, the optional limited slip differential that was available that year and almost never specified on cars sold in the American market because American buyers of the period did not generally know to ask for it. He drove it for 4 years, Ellis said. 34,000 miles, Theo said. 8,500 miles per year, which is the annual distance of a man who uses a car he loves as a car and not as an object. Then in 1976, the car went into storage at a private facility in the San Joaquin Valley. He closed the folder. He picked up his coffee. The car did not come out again. Why? Marcus said from across the room. He had come in quietly during the conversation and was standing near the door with the studied casualness of someone trying not to interrupt something by being present. Theo was quiet for a moment. His wife, he said. She had been in an accident. In this car. She survived. The medical record is not in the title history, and it would not be. But the timing is there if you know to look for it. The storage date and the accident date are separated by 11 days. He set the coffee down and looked at his hands. He could not look at it anymore, but he could not let it go either. So he did what people do when they love something and cannot be near it. He kept it somewhere he didn't have to see it and paid for the keeping, and hoped that eventually the feeling would resolve itself into something he could manage. A pause. It didn't. The warehouse was quiet. Outside, the city made its ambient sounds, the low, steady frequency of a place that didn't stop for things like this. He paid the storage fees every year for 31 years, Theo continued. When he died in 2007, his estate continued to pay them. His daughter authorized the auction when the estate needed the facility cleared. She did not know what she was authorizing. The auction house did not know what they were receiving. They gave it a 4-paragraph lot description and a $40,000 estimate and scheduled it between a Jaguar and a Camaro, and the room laughed when they brought it in on the dolly. He stood up. His knees registered the movement in the small way they always did now. You should call Haruki, he said. Ellis looked at him. Haruki Mori, Theo said. He's in Osaka. Theo wrote the name on a piece of paper and slid it across the bench along with a phone number. He collects first-generation Japanese performance cars. Private, serious, 30 years of it. He doesn't attend auctions and he doesn't appear in publications. He picked up his equipment case. He is also Roy Matsuda's nephew. He said this last sentence the way he said the things that mattered most, without additional framing, as though the sentence was sufficient, which it was. He walked to the door. Stopped. The note, he said. without turning around. Under the seat. It stays where it is, Ellis said. Theo nodded once. He opened the door and went out into the afternoon. Ellis called the number that evening from the office. It was early morning in Osaka. The man who answered had a voice that carried the specific quality of people who have spent long periods of time in quiet, focused environments. Unhurried, precise, comfortable with silence in a way that could be mistaken for coldness and wasn't. The first call lasted 12 minutes and covered nothing personal. Ellis described what he had. Haruki asked questions that told Ellis, within the first 3 minutes, that the man understood exactly what was being described and did not need it simplified or augmented. He asked about the paint code. He asked about the drivetrain documentation. He asked about the storage records. He did not ask the price. At the end of the first call, he asked Ellis to send Theo's authentication report when it was ready. Ellis said it would be ready the following morning. Haruki said he would review it and suggested they speak again in 24 hours. The second call the following evening was different from the beginning. It began, as the first had, with questions about the documentation. But 10 minutes in, when Ellis mentioned Roy Matsuda's name in the context of describing the build sheet specifications, the line went quiet for a length of time that was longer than a normal pause and shorter than a natural break. "My uncle," Haruki said. He said it quietly, without effect. But the two words changed the quality of the conversation in the way that certain pieces of information changed the quality of everything around them once introduced. "You knew him," Ellis said. "As a child," Haruki said. "He was not someone who spoke often about himself. He was an engineer. He thought in systems and tolerances. But there was one occasion, I was perhaps 10 years old, when he spoke about a car. He did not say the model. He did not say the year. He said he had made a mistake, and that the mistake was not what most people would call a mistake. It was a decision he had made from a place of pain, and that he had not been able to go back and correct it, and that this was something a person had to carry." A pause. He never spoke about it again. I was old enough to understand that questions were not welcome, so I did not ask them. And then he was gone, and I could not ask them. Ellis waited. "Can you send me photographs?" Haruki said. "Of everything, including the interior." "Tonight," Ellis said. He sent 340 photographs and a complete copy of the documentation file and Theo's report and the title history. He sent everything. He did not include the note under the seat in the documentation. He mentioned in a separate message that a personal item had been found with the car, and that it was being preserved in place, and that he considered it part of the vehicle's history, rather than a separate artifact. Haruki's response to that message came 2 hours later. It was 4 words. "Thank you. I understand." On the morning of the 7th day, Ellis arrived at the warehouse at 6:20 and made coffee and stood in front of the Datsun in the early quiet with the cup warming his hands and looked at the car the way he had been looking at things his entire adult life, not assessing, not calculating, simply present with it the way his father had been present with machines, giving them the attention that serious things deserved. The car had not been touched since its arrival. The oxidized paint remained. The dent in the rear quarter remained. The missing wiper blade had not been replaced. The surface rust along the rockers had not been treated. The interior was exactly as found, down to the position of the rear-view mirror, which was angled 3 degrees off-center in the way that the last person to sit in the driver's seat had left it, a detail that Ellis had noticed on the first day and had not corrected because it was not his to correct. The note was under the seat, in the rearmost corner against the rail, folded twice, the color of paper that has been white for a very long time. His phone showed an email from Haruki Mori's representative that had arrived at 6:04 that morning, Osaka time translating to the night here, which meant Haruki had sent it before he went to sleep, or had not slept, or had decided that the time difference was less relevant than the decision. Ellis read the email. It was brief, professionally worded, and contained a number: $9,200,000. Final offer. No negotiation requested or expected. There was one additional paragraph. The car was to be transported to Osaka in its current storage configuration. Original dust cover, if located. Original wheel chocks. All documentation. And the personal item found with the vehicle, which was to remain in its current position and was not to be read, catalogued, or disturbed further. He set the coffee down on the workbench. He stood in the quiet for a moment. Outside, the city was beginning its morning, the low sound of it building at the edges, trucks on the boulevard, someone's radio, the ordinary noise of a place resuming itself after the pause of night. He called Petra. She answered on the second ring, which meant she had been awake. "It came in," he said. "How much?" she said. He told her. The line was quiet. "The man who laughed," Petra said. "Yes," Ellis said. "He's going to read about it in a magazine, in about 6 weeks. And then, what do you think he'll say?" Ellis looked at the car, at the oxidized paint that was not a flaw but a record, at the dent that was not damage but history, at the missing wiper blade that no one had replaced because no one had driven it anywhere in 50 years. At the rearview mirror angled 3 degrees off-center in the position of the last person who had sat in the driver's seat and adjusted it to their own eyeline, and then gotten out and not come back. At the thing the room had laughed at. "He'll say it was luck," Ellis said. "He'll say I got lucky. Maybe he'll say the buyer was sentimental. He'll find a way to make the number make sense inside the system he already has for understanding what things are worth." He picked up his coffee. "Because the alternative is to consider that the system might have a gap in it, and that's harder." "Is it luck?" Petra said. Ellis was quiet for a moment. "My father used to stand in the garage," he said, "and look at something that wasn't running and just listen to it. He'd stand there for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, not touching it, just standing with it. And I used to watch him from the door and think he was doing nothing." A pause. He wasn't doing nothing. He ended the call. He finished his coffee. He stood with the car for another few minutes in the quiet of the early morning, in the warehouse that smelled like oil and old metal and time, and then he picked up his phone and called Haruki Mori's representative and accepted the offer and made the arrangements and began the process of returning a thing to the person who should have had it all along. The transport took 11 days. The car traveled in a climate-controlled container on a specific routing that Ellis had reviewed personally and that Haruki's people had reviewed independently and that both parties had agreed upon, not because either of them didn't trust the carrier, but because the car was worth being careful about. The dust cover had been located in the storage records. The facility in the San Joaquin Valley had maintained a secondary log of items stored with the vehicle, and the cover appeared there, described simply as canvas covering. Original. It had been in a separate bag in the same unit. Ellis had it transferred without unfolding it, because unfolding it after 50 years of being folded would have been, in his opinion, an intervention the car hadn't asked for. The wheel chocks were wooden, which surprised him. He'd expected something more industrial. They were cut from a dense hardwood, shaped by hand, with a smoothness on the contact surface that came from use before the storage, and a dryness on everything else that came from the decades after. He photographed them from 6 angles before they were packed. The car itself was loaded without ceremony. No special event, no invited observers, no photographs of the loading for promotional purposes. Ellis had been clear about this with Haruki's representative, and the representative had relayed that Haruki concurred. A car was not a performance. Moving it from one place to another was not an occasion. It was simply a thing being done correctly. The facility outside Osaka was not what Ellis had expected, though he was not sure what he had expected. It was not ostentatious. It was a long, low building in a rural area outside the city, surrounded by mature trees, accessed by a gravel road that made noise under tires in the way that gravel roads did when they had been laid properly. Inside, the lighting was even and gentle. the kind of lighting that illuminated without creating conditions. The temperature was consistent in the way that investment and attention made things consistent. The cars in the collection were arranged with the particular logic of a person who had been thinking about the arrangement for a long time and had arrived at something that made sense to them and required no explanation to anyone else who was paying attention. They were not grouped by era or by manufacturer. They were grouped by something harder to name, something that had to do with the quality of the intention behind them, the seriousness with which they had been made. Haruki Mori was a small man in his mid-70s with the bearing of someone who had spent decades doing something that mattered to him, which is the bearing that tends to make people look settled in themselves in a way that has nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with having found the right work. He bowed when Ellis arrived. Ellis returned the bow imperfectly, and Haruki received the imperfection without acknowledgement, which was its own form of grace. They did not speak much. The car had been positioned in a space that had clearly been prepared for it, and they stood in front of it for a while in the way that people stood in front of things that deserved to be stood in front of. At some point, Haruki said something quietly in Japanese. Ellis did not understand the words. He understood the tone. It was the tone of someone completing something they had not known they were carrying until it was done. Ellis flew home the following morning. He sat in the window seat of the long flight and read nothing and slept for a few hours and looked at the cloud cover over the Pacific, which was featureless and enormous and did not remind him of anything in particular. He thought about his father in the driveway, about the sentence that had taken 25 years to understand completely. They'll overlook what they can't read. He thought about what the room had looked like when they brought the Datsun in on the dolly, about the particular quality of that laughter, the ease of it, the way it came without hesitation from people who knew what things were supposed to look like and had found something that didn't match the template. He thought about Reginald Voss reading the article in the magazine 6 weeks from now, about the calculation he would perform automatically without deciding to, the calculation of what he had missed and what it had cost, about the conclusion he would reach, which would be the comfortable conclusion, the one that didn't require him to revise anything fundamental. He thought about the note under the seat. He would never know what it said. He had decided that the moment he refolded it and put it back, some things were not purchased, some things were returned. The cloud cover broke somewhere over the northern Pacific and the ocean appeared below, enormous and gray and moving in patterns that had been moving in the same patterns since before there had been anyone to look at them. Ellis looked at it for a while, and then closed the window shade and closed his eyes and let the sound of the engines carry him the rest of the way home. Reginald Voss read about the sale 7 weeks later. He was in the living room of his house in Greenwich, in the chair he used for reading, with the particular catalog that his assistant ordered for him every quarter from a specialist dealer in London. The article appeared in the middle of the publication, 4 columns, a photograph of the 240Z that had been taken at the Osaka facility after its arrival. In the photograph, the car was still in its original condition, oxidized paint, the dent in the rear quarter, the space where the wiper blade was missing. Someone had made the editorial decision to print it without restoration, which Ellis had specifically arranged with Haruki's permission. Voss read the article once, quickly, the way he read most things. Then he read it again, more slowly. He read the number. He read it a third time. He set the magazine down on the glass table beside the chair. He sat for a while, looking at the middle distance of the room, which contained, among other things, a painting he had bought at auction 12 years ago for a number he had been pleased with at the time and had since been told was above market, a fact he had absorbed and set aside because it was not useful to him to hold it. The magazine stayed on the table. His assistant, a young man named Oliver who had been with him for 2 years and had learned the geography of Voss's moods the way people learned the geography of places they inhabited constantly, noted on the third day that the magazine was still on the table and that it had been opened each time he passed it to the same page. He noted this without mentioning it. He noted it again on the 7th day, and the 14th, and the 21st. On the day it finally left the table, Oliver found it not in the recycling and not in the stack of catalogs on the sideboard, but on the shelf in the study, horizontal, between two reference books on automotive history that had not been moved in years. He did not say anything about this either. Some things, he had learned, were not his to say anything about. Ellis Carver went back to the auction houses. He went back to the rooms where the laughter came from the left side and the paddles carried firm names and the estimates were set by people who had learned to read the obvious things and stopped there, content in the legibility of their knowledge, comfortable in the language they had mastered and had decided was sufficient. He went back because they were where the overlooked things were. Not always. Not every lot. Not every session, but with enough consistency that the going back was worth the going. There were other Datsuns, in other conditions, in other rooms, wearing other forms of the same surface evidence, that said to the unprepared eye that nothing here was worth attending to. There were other estates where the heirs had packed without looking and the auction houses had catalogued without reading, and the rooms had formed their assessments on the evidence available to people who had not developed over years of specific attention, the capacity to see past it. He went back and he sat near the back wall and he watched what the room laughed at. And sometimes, not every time, but enough times, what the room laughed at was the thing he had come for. His father had stood in the garage in the early evening, wiping his hands on a shop rag, looking at a car that didn't run, and said that most people couldn't read. He had not said it with contempt. He had not said it with superiority. He had said it the way he said things that were simply true, with the flatness of someone reporting a condition rather than offering a judgment. It was a condition. Not a failure, not a moral shortcoming. A condition. The world was full of things that required a specific kind of attention to be legible. The world was also full of people who had developed their attention in one direction and assumed the direction was the whole of it. The gap between those two facts was where Ellis Carver had made his career. And somewhere in a facility outside Osaka, in the company of 31 years of carefully selected machines, a 1972 Datsun 240Z sat under its original canvas cover in the temperature-controlled quiet, with its original paint, and its original dent, and its original chalks, and the original handwriting of a man who had loved it and lost his way back to it under the driver's seat, in the same position it had occupied for 50 years, in the rearmost corner against the rail, folded twice. The note said something. It would stay folded. Some things were not for the room. Some things had never been for the room. The room was always going to laugh. That was, in the end, not the problem. That was the entire point.